I want to talk today about the lies we tell ourselves about who we are. Specifically in today's chat, I'll be taking a Jungian perspective, meaning inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist who broke off from Freud back in the day. Check my other videos on Jungian psychology if you need a deeper dive into what it is. But to give you a simplified version of how Jung saw the structure of the mind. Like Freud, he believed that the psyche was split up into conscious and unconscious, and that over the course of socialization, as we grew up and matured, our ego developed, which started to shun things that weren't societally or familially accepted, aspects of the self that weren't socially acceptable. And as the ego started shunning those things to the unconscious, it also started forming something called the persona, the mask we wear publicly, who we want to show people that we are. And then the very opposite of that persona, everything that is ego-dystonic, meaning everything that our ego doesn't like about us, gets personified into something called the shadow self. So you have consciously the persona and the ego working very hard to keep you ego-syntonic, and you have under that its very opposite, the shadow self, the unconscious realm of the psyche. The self, according to a Jungian perspective, is the totality of all of it. It is the persona and the shadow. It's the conscious and the unconscious, the ego-syntonic and the ego-dystonic. The self is wholeness. The self is integration. It's not just what we want to be. It's also everything we want very hard not to be. It's both shadow and light. Think about it this way. Let's imagine that you're taking some sort of personality test and it's trying to test a specific trait, like whether you're more quiet or loud. So you have on one end if you're 100% quiet, and you have on the other end if you're 100% loud. And you may like to think of yourself as somewhere on that linear spectrum. You might like to think that you are 82% quiet, 18% loud. What you don't understand is that you are the entire spectrum. You are both quiet and loud. That is the self. That is the totality of you. Because you are also sometimes what you wish not to be, and everything that you wish not to be gets personified inside you in the unconscious. You are the whole spectrum, not a point on it. So keeping this in mind, what are the lies that we tell ourselves about our identities? What are the lies that we tell about ourselves and other people? One is that as children, we start to tell kids, you're so this, you're so that, and they start to become these self-fulfilling prophecies. And we're in part shaping who the children become and who their shadows become. Let's say, for instance, that you're a mother and you have a kid who is very talented at writing. And you tell them that. You say, hey, you are so good at writing. You're awesome at that, little guy. The child is going to internalize that and keep telling themselves that over the course of their life. They're going to start to identify with being a good writer. And as time goes on, if sometimes they brush up against maybe a difficult assignment in school where they don't do so well, or an English teacher that doesn't really resonate with them, what do you think is going to happen? The shadow self gets triggered. The part of them rears its head that lingers in the dark, everything that they wish not to be, everything that they think that they're not. And when that happens, it's very difficult to have self-compassion because the ego wants to be completely aligned with its values. The ego doesn't want to be exact opposite of its values. So we have to be very careful, especially when speaking with children, because they're like sponges, they absorb everything. We have to be very mindful of the things we tell them about who they are, because those stories can become very limiting to them. They need to be able to choose almost like a tabula rasa. They need to be the ones to decide what they can and cannot do. Another way that we tell lies is we tell stories about who we are. We like to think of ourselves as holding certain clusters of traits. For instance, I like to think of myself as a tidy person, a person that's attentive to detail, a person that is eloquent. I don't think of myself as somebody that's particularly good at math. I don't think of myself as a particularly extroverted person. In this day and age, we see so many of these limiting narratives among particularly young people who want very badly to believe that there is something pathological with them, who want for there to be something wrong with them psychologically or sometimes even physically, who say, no, I can't be organized because I have ADHD. No, I can't be socially savvy because I have autism spectrum disorder. No, I can't turn in my homework because I have POTS. The narratives we tell about ourselves are always limiting in some way, but some are a lot more limiting than others. Now, no one's denying maybe you do have ADHD, ASD, POTS. The issue is not in the diagnosis. The issue is in how you identify yourself. Because when you identify yourself with the conscious aspects of you, you're not seeing yourself fully. You're not seeing the totality of the self. You're not seeing that, yeah, maybe sometimes you struggle to be socially savvy, but other times you're quite good at getting intimate with people. The stories that we tell about ourselves are sometimes overly negative, or sometimes they're overly positive. In this example, when they're negative, when they say, no, I can't do this because I'm this way, it's still the ego getting its needs met, because the ego on some level wants to be reassured. It wants you and the people around you to reassure it so that then you can feel good about yourself. The self with a capital S doesn't care about those things. The self with a capital S understands that sometimes it struggles with those things and sometimes not, and neither of them define the self. Now, other times the ego tells an overly positive story. It tells us that we're the greatest person in the world. We're so good at all these different traits. I mean, there's a reason why in almost every single field, people tend to believe that they are better than average at what they do, which mathematically just doesn't add up. I mean, I said I'm not good at math, but even I understand that doesn't add up. When we tell ourselves these idealized versions of who we are, when we over-identify with a persona without realizing that it's not really who we fully are, then when we come into contact with somebody who activates a part of our shadows, we can be very critical and judgmental and hard on them. We can start pointing fingers and saying, well, you shouldn't do that because that's not according to my values. You know what they say, when you point one finger, you got 3 others pointing back at you. Because we don't like to see aspects of ourselves that we've shunned, either in ourselves or in other people. When we see them in other people, it reminds us that we have that capability within ourselves, and we instantly want to distract from that. We instantly want to start pointing fingers and assigning blame. For example, let's say that you always want to be a very kind person, and you notice somebody expressing their anger in a very blunt way. You might feel tempted in that moment to say, wow, I don't think they should do that. That wasn't very nice of them. Because really what you're saying in that moment is, I have that capability inside me too. I sometimes overreact to things when I'm angry too, and I feel a lot of shame about that. And so in order to repress that side of me, I'm going to shame the person in front of me. When in reality, when we come into contact with someone who activates our shadows, what we should do instead is lean into it and wonder, where is this judgment coming from? What part of my shadow is this activating? What is it that I feel ashamed of now about myself? Because if I were to fully do the shadow work and integrate that into the totality of myself, I wouldn't be so shocked that this person's overreacting a little bit in the way that they're expressing their anger, because I would understand that sometimes it happens. There is anger just as there is kindness. And look, nobody's perfect at this. Nobody is free of judgment or free of criticizing other people who are falling short of their values. It's a constant process. You constantly have to implement this as you go about your life in order to gain more insight about yourself and integrate the unconscious along with the conscious. Another lie that we tell ourselves is that we can be perfect, that the persona can somehow fine-tune itself to be beyond reproach. The brighter a light shines, the darker the shadow is going to be, right? You don't really see shadows on overcast days when it's not very bright. The brighter you try to make your persona, the darker your shadow is going to be as well. And so if you try to idealize yourself or burn yourself out with perfectionism, you're going to have a monster buried under your porch. The goal is not self-esteem. The goal is not, let me try to be the best person that I could possibly be. The goal is self-compassion towards both the persona and the shadow, acknowledging that both are part of who I am. So what is a healthier alternative to telling ourselves these lies about who we are? Well, we can stop thinking of ourselves in such limited terms, in terms of, I have these traits and I am not good at these things. We can instead start to acknowledge a more integrated, whole version of ourselves. We can acknowledge our shadows, we can get to know them a little bit. We can practice compassion for them, and we can try not to label ourselves, because labels are inherently limiting. Now, masks can be fun. You know, I love Halloween. I love dressing up for the occasion. Masks are an opportunity to play around with different personas, and that is in part healthy. You should experiment with different ways of being, different traits that you want to tinker with. And you should also have an intact ego, because if you don't have an intact ego, that is essentially psychosis. You don't see the difference between yourself and the environment. We need an ego to function. The goal is not ego death. The goal is merely self-compassion towards the full self and not limiting ourselves. Playing around with different masks, different personas, but not treating them like chains that have to keep us stuck in one place forever. And it's also healthier to have compassion for the totality of others. To not label them, to not say this is a bad person or this person is cruel, and instead to see that sometimes they're cruel, sometimes they're not. Nobody is all of one thing. Everybody is one thing and its polar opposite at once. And when you notice yourself feeling judgment towards other people, lean into it. Lean into what it means about yourself, not about that person. I think you'll find that a lot of our identities are essentially illusions created by our ego. And again, that's not all bad. We need the ego to survive. It's healthy to have an ego. Just don't let it get to a point where it's starting to impact your life. Have a great day.